Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of the Council and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, I'm delighted to welcome our audience and distinguished speakers to this conversation on the future of military mobility in Europe. As we look to discuss what's been a long-standing issue in European security circles, it's important to note that the world today is fundamentally different than the one when we began in earlier this year. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken hundreds of thousands of lives, shut down our economies and societies, and drawn almost the entirety of the world's attention and resources, and rightly so. But as our governments manage this crisis, we at the Atlantic Council are trying to help our leaders think through the many implications of COVID-19. And we do so with a focus on our core founding mission, how to help support peace and security, particularly for the transatlantic community, by shaping the future together with our allies and our partners. So even as the world is consumed by the crisis at hand, it's a reminder to ensure that we keep other aspects of our security strong, and few are more important than the North Atlantic Alliance. As NATO Deputy Secretary General Mircea Joanna said on our virtual stage last week, there is no human activity that can be built in the absence of peace. Peace is the precondition of human dignity. This is the business of NATO, to keep 1 billion people at peace. NATO is the bedrock upon which our freedom to combat this pandemic and our ability to do so collectively rests. So even in these times, that means it's important to ensure that NATO can always ably provide for the defense of Europe. And that's why I'm glad to be here today to help kick off the launch of our newest flagship report, Moving Out, a comprehensive assessment of military mobility in Europe. This report tackles the critical question of how in a crisis can NATO move an immense amount of troops and equipment over the Atlantic and across numerous European borders to support and defend the sovereignty of our allies. As you'll hear from our panelists today, this is an incredibly complex issue that's being addressed by so many different actors in NATO and the European Union and national governments. And as the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us, when security challenges extend across national boundaries, so too must our solutions. So I continue to be impressed how this remarkable task force and this team have mapped and assessed this issue set. They've truly pulled together a comprehensive assessment of every political, financial, operational, technical, and regulatory aspect of military mobility. And in true Scowcroft Center fashion, have provided a roadmap of recommendations to reinvigorate and guide continued progress on this issue. So with that twofold approach, I'm confident this study is the first full treatment of the military mobility challenge and is a best-in-class report on the subject. Kudos to the team. This is also a second study in a series that's been produced by our Transatlantic Security Initiative that's meant to define a collective strategy for defense in Europe. So this follows on our study on U.S. force posture in Europe called Permanent Deterrence. And both of these reports, I believe, serve as benchmarks for adapting and improving the United States and NATO's approach to defense and deterrence. This has been a pretty monumental effort to manage. And in that regard, I'd like to pay particular thanks to our co-chairs, Ambassador Colleen Bell and General Curtis Scaparrotti, both board directors of the Atlantic Council. Thank you for your leadership on this issue and your guidance as we've honed in on these important issues. I also want to give a shout out and thank you to our project director, Wayne Schroeder, our rapporteur and exceptional staff, Clementine Starling and Connor Rada, and our distinguished and expert group of task force members for their excellent insights and tireless efforts. You'll hear from some of them in the conversation today, and we're really honored to be joined by General Cavoli and NATO Assistant Secretary General Patrick Turner from Europe to offer their comments in this regard as well. So I want to encourage everyone to read the report. You'll get a sense of the commitment they all put in this project. And one additional note for our audience. Both of our panels today will be devoting some time to answer your questions. So if you've got questions you would like to answer, please go ahead and submit them, and feel free to do that throughout the conversation via Zoom's Q&A chat feature. And for those of you not on Zoom but watching through other platforms, you can join the discussion by following Atlantic Council, AC Scowcroft, and using the hashtag #ACDefense, hashtag #ACDefense, where we will also collect questions from the audience. Now with that, I'm thrilled to welcome Ambassador Colleen Bell to our virtual stage. She's the director of the California Film Commission, serving in the cabinet of Governor Newsom, working on business and economic development issues. She served as a U.S. ambassador to Hungary, where she became quite familiar with many of these issues related to the alliance. She's a remarkable philanthropist, a talented TV producer, a strong proponent of a healthy transatlantic alliance, a good friend, and an Atlantic Council board director. And so with that, Ambassador, let me turn to you out in California. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Damon. It's so nice to see you this morning. And
Great
thank
to
you
see
for the
you.
kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be joining you today to help kick off this event and launch what I believe is a landmark study on military mobility in Europe. As you'll hear in a few minutes from our speakers, this is not just a small issue on NATO's agenda. Improving mobility into, across, and out of Europe is instead the critical next step for defense and deterrence in Europe. Without the ability to reinforce our most exposed allies on Europe's flanks, NATO's posture of small frontline forces to its east, supported by large, able, and ready forces provided by allies on both sides of the Atlantic, could be dangerously exposed. Addressing this issue requires an incredible amount of coordination between civilian and military sectors in governments and between NATO and the EU. To be sure, NATO, the EU, and nations have taken major steps to support and improve the mobility of forces in Europe. But these efforts continue to face hurdles that, without continued political momentum, are unlikely to be overcome. With decreasing emphasis from some governments, a greater and more coherent effort is needed, one that addresses the full spectrum of challenges that hinder further progress. This is a point made clear in the study, and over the past year, I've been proud to have co-chaired alongside General Scaparrotti a remarkable task force of security experts and former and current defense officials, which has worked to thoroughly map this issue set. Through an exhaustive series of meetings with officials from national governments, NATO, and the EU, and through the sheer effort and commitment of our task force members, we have produced a report, the first of its kind, that addresses the full scope of military mobility efforts. The report lays out and assesses current activities to improve mobility, identifies the remaining challenges, and importantly, offers a path forward for the many actors involved to reorient and drive home the progress already achieved. Through our study, we lay out 4 key challenges that must be addressed. Political momentum was in full force in 2018, but is at risk of dropping off as nations focus elsewhere, particularly in the face of COVID-19. The Military Mobility Initiative, which requires major investment in new infrastructure, is underfunded in the short and long term by all those involved. Cyber and network resilience, our ability to protect critical infrastructure from attack by Russia or others, is missing as a source of funding priority in Europe. Greater investment in the infrastructure, the mode of transport, which most forces would use, is immediately feasible for nations. NATO and the EU would have the largest impact on mobility across the continent. These are not insurmountable challenges. Rather, it is a coordinated strategy that is lacking, and I believe the report presents such a strategy in great detail. I encourage you all to read the full report to get a sense of the truly comprehensive and detailed approach of the task force. These recommendations add value to this debate. To regain momentum on this issue, these recommendations include: build an improved NATO-EU dialogue to support information sharing, coordinated action, and strategic messaging between the organizations through a structured political dialogue. A joint working group at the staff level and a military-focused competence center to translate military requirements into funding priorities. Fully resource military mobility projects by recommitting funding from the EU towards mobility, including military mobility requirements for nations in NATO, defense planning, and linking mobility goals to NATO's existing readiness goals. prioritize infrastructure spending that directly supports military requirements, is resilient to cyber and other threats, and expands our capacity to move forces wherever and whenever necessary. And exercise, exercise, exercise. I saw many of these when I served as the US ambassador to Hungary. Allied exercises like the recent Defender 20 iteration lay bare the challenges we face and force us to act. Continue them with purpose, learn from them, and improve upon them so we can better be prepared for any crisis. Recommendations such as these and others in the report, coupled with a greater public awareness of the importance of military mobility built through events such as this, represent a path forward to reinvigorate military mobility projects in Europe. To that end, I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panelists for a fireside chat who will discuss military mobility fits into NATO's defense and deterrence posture and what our military forces need to execute NATO's defense plans. Joining us is my co-chair, the extraordinary General Curtis Scaparrotti, former Supreme Allied Commander and Commander of US European Command, as well as, I would say, the architect of much of NATO's current defense posture. Alongside him is Lieutenant General Christopher Cavoli, Commander of US Army Europe and a career infantryman who has spearheaded the Defender 20 exercise, the largest return of US forces to Europe since the end of the Cold War. And moderating the conversation is Dr. Corey Shockey, the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, who has led a distinguished career in and out of government, focusing on defense and national security issues. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us this morning. And Corey, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It is a real joy to have the chance to wring even more information out of the two people most knowledgeable about this subject, maybe literally in the world, retired General Curtis Scaparrotti and Lieutenant General Cavoli. General Scaparrotti, let me start with you. Give us a sense of why military mobility is so important now. I mean, NATO's had an integrated military command since 1950 or 51, and we've always had integrated defense plans. Why is this urgent now?
Corey, it's good to see you. Thank you for moderating. It's great to work with you again. And before I start, I'll just say the same to Chris. I haven't seen him personally since I left Europe, but it's always excellent to have a discussion with Chris. And, Corey, what I'd like to do first is just to answer that question, I think to go back and look at the evolution of deterrence and defense in Europe answers that question in a couple of ways. First of all, in the Cold War, our strategy was to have a large force forward in close proximity to the defensive line. So at that time, we had almost 300,000 troops, U.S. troops in Europe, along with our allies, in close proximity to their defensive lines. That was the practice that we had until the time that the Berlin Wall fell. And then we went to a period of time where we looked to the Russians to be partners. NATO turned toward expeditionary operations in the Balkans and later in the Middle East. And military mobility became less of a focus over a time period. And then with 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea, entry into the Donbass and other aggressive acts, we realized that they're no longer a partner, but an adversary. And so NATO has taken a different strategy of, rather than forward forces, a robust forward presence. We've looked at rapid deployment as being really our strategy for deterrence and defense in Europe. To do that, we have to have ready forces. We have to set conditions with equipment forward and a capable force to do that. But we also have to reinforce at the speed of conflict. And for that to work, you have to have mobility available. You have to have the infrastructure, the policies in place. You have to have the assets to do that. So essentially, our strategy rests on the fact that we need to be able to move and move large forces quickly to have a credible deterrent, and if conflict comes, defense. And so it's ever more important today than it has been in the past. And as I said, there was a period of time that we took our eye off the ball in terms of mobility, its infrastructure, and its assets. And I'll leave it at that for now.
General Cavoli, may I turn to you to give us a sense of, in particular, the Defender 20 exercise, which was designed to test the existing mobility. Do you feel like, as you look at the recommendations from the report in particular, are there things that you noticed in designing and participating in the exercise that are validated? Is there anything they missed?
Sure. Thanks, Corey. First of all, thanks for inviting me to do this. This is a wonderful opportunity to discuss this. It's great to see you again, General Scaparrotti. It's great to see you, and I've seen a number of very familiar names on the attendee list right now. So to all my colleagues and friends out there, hello. If I could start, Corey, actually by adding a little bit to what General Scaparrotti just talked about. It wasn't just that we took our eye off the ball for a while there because of our arrangement. It's that the space that we were traveling across expanded vastly from the end of the Cold War until now. And there are, additional NATO members who previously were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and their infrastructure was unknown to us. It was unused by us. It wasn't built for our sort of equipment necessarily. So the problem is pretty complicated indeed, and agility is really, really important. During the Cold War, we had very good ideas on where we thought our adversary would attack and with what sort of force, and now things are much more unclear. We don't have those variables pinned down. So our ability to move rapidly across formerly unknown territory to us, to a wide variety of different places quickly, really is the operational level requirement for military mobility. So we did start practicing this under General Scap's watch a few years ago. In 2015, we started doing the large exercises that Ambassador Bell mentioned a few minutes ago from her experience in Hungary. And we've been moving rotational forces back and forth, conducting emergency deployment exercises to draw pre-positioned equipment. We started pre-positioning additional equipment here. So we were doing a number of things, but they were mostly sort of in microcosm, little pieces of what a larger deployment would look like. And, the challenge with the Army operations is that usually physics and practical things like that determine their success. And so quantity takes on a quality all its own in something like a deployment operation. And we determined that it was necessary to practice at scale. So the U.S. Army put together an exercise to deploy a division plus of heavy vehicles over here with soldiers, and to conduct a series of exercises with our allies during that period. As you know, it was truncated because of the COVID outbreak, but quite a bit was actually done, and it shows that we've made some real progress, but there's quite a bit of work left to be done. So to give you an idea of what actually moved over here, we moved about 13,000 soldiers from the U.S. into Europe, and about 9,000 pieces of equipment, from tanks down to Humvees. We drew 2,000 pieces of heavy equipment, tracked vehicles and support vehicles, out of pre-positioned stocks that we have in Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany, and moved them to an issue point. And we moved people all over the place within the continent. We set up 8 large-scale logistical support areas that could support 25,000 people. We did that with host nation support from our allies, many of whom actually paid for all of that. And we did a lot of onward movement of this equipment. So a great deal was done, and it went pretty smoothly. It went quite smoothly. because of the work that we've been doing for the past few years. The work we've been doing for the past few years, moving around, but most importantly, changing the way we do business has really started to pay off during this exercise. Specifically, the Alliance, as an alliance, has developed the Allied Movement Coordination Center and the Movement Control Center for Europe, both of which are highlighted in the report. And by the way, I should take a moment to commend the authors of the report. It's really well done and highlights the key issues. We've also established the Joint Support and Enabling Command, which will run the processes and coordinate the processes of a reinforcement at scale for the Alliance. And we have seen significant changes in policy, most of them at a bilateral or multilateral level. Clearance times, I guess if I could estimate, clearance times to get diplomatic clearance to move across a border have probably dropped by about a third. Poland, for example, went from a very hard and fast 30-day advance notice requirement to 5 days. All three Baltic countries have gone from 15 to 5 days. Overflight's a little bit easier. So some really good things were done. NATO put the NATO force integration units into several countries in what was previously non-NATO territory. And of course, many nations set up national movement control centers. So all of that really helped. In addition to that, we also have learned a lot, as the U.S. Army has, about how to conduct these reinforcement operations more efficiently and everything. So we've just gotten better at it. So that's the good news. The not so good news that comes out is there's plenty of work left to be done. And the report really highlights that very nicely. The work really comes down to maintaining the momentum, as Ambassador Bell pointed out a few minutes ago. The momentum, and especially the resources to keep things going, are going to require us to really keep our eye on the ball and make sure that we keep evaluating the military requirements and getting them into the infrastructure plans, especially. The infrastructure in Eastern Europe wasn't really designed to hold tanks that weigh more than 70 tons, and all of ours do in the western part of Europe. So that momentum is going to be critical. It's going to be challenged by the aftermath of COVID-19, I would say, and we can talk about that a little more in a moment.
Before we move on to the problems of sustaining momentum, I want to ask one more question about degree of difficulty to General Scaparrotti, because one of the reasons your expertise and judgment is so important on this issue is that I think you and General Ridgway may be the only two Supreme Allied commanders that were also commanders of U.S. Forces Korea. Can you give us a sense of how much more difficult it is to work these issues across national boundaries and across variances in economic development and infrastructure of the kinds that General Cavoli just outlined that we deal with in NATO?
Yeah, Corey, certainly. If I just look back at the time that I was the SAC-Euro, we had focused on the needs of increasing readiness, of improving our infrastructure, of working closely with the EU and the need to do that, for instance, and the individual nations to have success. But something as simple as even changing policy for the time they needed for a border crossing took almost 3 years of work, mainly because you had to get an agreement across then, 28, 29, now 30 nations. Agreement with partners as well, which have influence on this. And then once we began to operate, as Chris said, we've been practicing this in smaller deployments in order to start getting some muscle memory and finding out where our issues were at. But we also learned that even if you change the policy, until that is all the way down to the person that's standing at that border on both sides, you still have a problem. So that's just one example of how complicated this can be when you have that many nations involved, as well as large institutions. And then last, each nation has its own interest, and it has varying perspective on what's important to them presently. And as you know, within the alliance, there's a different perspective from those who are in the South and the West as opposed to those in the East. And so you have to work that part of the equation as well, rather hard. And within NATO, what I found is that that's an awful lot of communication, discussion, intellectual support for what you need to get done in order to get the right kind of momentum. And I think the momentum piece of this is a part of this report. One of the things that I was very staunch supporter of doing this report is we're at a time where I think we need this kind of spotlight on mobility so that we can continue to move forward.
We have a fabulous stack of questions already coming in. And so I'm going to turn to them. But before I do, I just want to reinforce the importance of the timing of this report, because even before the COVID-19 pandemic, which is going to create sustained downward pressure on defense spending in all of our countries, the European Union countries were considering zeroing out their support for mobility initiatives. And I don't want to put either of you in the position of having to comment on that. So I'm going to fire directly on their ramparts and say that choosing to do that even before there was the pressure of competing requirements from the pandemic will only reinforce the kind of criticism that President Trump and many other Americans have made, that Europeans are doing too little and Americans are doing too much. So it really matters to do something which has civilian and economic carryovers that also dramatically strengthens our ability to carry out our common defense. So with that sermon, let me begin turning to the questions. The first is from Ahmet, and it's about the EU's common security and defense policy. And he asks, with the increased military mobility effort, do you think the CSDP will start to shift to more territorial defense? Let me recast the question slightly and ask you, General Cavoli, whether you, in your engagement with your European military counterparts, see any indications of that.
Well, the alliance has very much refocused on territorial defense, on collective defense, as you know. We, as the U.S. Army in Europe, have focused on large-scale defensive operations now. All of my colleagues across the alliance have done the same with their land forces. General Scaparrotti and now General Walters have promulgated strategic guidance about collective defense that's really starting to shape the way we do business over here and everything. I would point out that most of those armies are also armies that are from countries that participate in the European Union as well. So there's certainly going to be some sort of just de facto institutional bleed over, I would say.
I want to direct the next question to you, General Scaparrotti. It's from Erwan Lagadek, and he asks, military mobility is surely required only as long as NATO doesn't deploy permanent substantial combat troops in Europe's east. Would you say that the lack of more permanently stationed troops is due to the NATO-Russia Founding Act? In which case, do mobility challenges that you lay out in the report indicate that the Founding Act should be scrapped?
Well, first of all, the Founding Act gives us the capability to put forces forward as we have and enhance forward presence, forces that aren't substantial. So I believe it gives us the room to do what we must do to set the conditions we need. I happen to be of the opinion that large forward forces are not the right answer, that in fact, rapid reinforcement is a better response in the security environment we're in today. Russia's fear is that there would actually be a threat on their border. And although they speak of that today with a force like the enhanced forward presence, I don't believe they honestly see that as a spearhead that could attack into Russia proper. I think they're military leaders, and the discussions I've had with them, they understand the posture that we're trying to establish. I actually think it's better policy, better politically, and we as an alliance have the capability to have a strategy of rapid reinforcement and have it be credible. There's no doubt in my mind, and I think in the long run, it's greater stability within Europe and therefore the globe as a whole.
Excellent. Let me seesaw back to you, General Cavoli, to answer Loredo's question, which is, what are the implications of closed borders for mobility? Are you concerned that the closing of borders in Europe in response to COVID-19 has implications for mobility?
Sure, thanks. First, if I could go back to General Scaparrotti's question and answer there. There's also, just a pure operational challenge with forward positioning the forces. You've got to know where to put them and what type of force to put into play. And that's not as clear as it used to be, and it's not as localized as it used to be. So the ability to move to the point of contact is really, really what we need now. We just have to be ready for more than we used to have to be ready for. To address the question, yeah, absolutely. So living over here, it was fascinating to watch the borders go back up across the Schengen zone almost immediately in the last month. Borders went back up and border controls went back in for very good reasons, very justifiable reasons to prevent the spread of the pandemic. But how we come out of it as an alliance with the European Union is going to be very important. It could be easy to see a future in which reestablishing the mobility that I was describing positively a few minutes ago would kind of get left behind, and I think it's going to require a great deal of attention and some political will on all of our part to make sure that mobility reassumes the track that it was on after we're done with the COVID outbreak.
So I am laughing up my sleeve, gentlemen, because we have another SAC you're heard from. General Wes Clark has just rolled in with a question for you, General Scaparrotti. He says, it's great to see you. It's been a long time between today and our days in Afghanistan. He asks, are you seeing worrying signs vis-a-vis the security situation in the high North and Arctic Circle, notably from Russia, but also from China's increased economic interest? And General Cavoli, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on that too. First, you, General Scaparrotti.
Well, General Clark, thank you for the question. It's good to hear from you. I've heard indirectly from others that have passed notes back and forth. I hope you got my regards as well. We have seen increasing concerns in the Arctic and the high North, and it continues today. You see Russia, for instance, pressing with their northern fleet more activities and also much more broader activity, more threatening activity in the high North off of our alliance's coasts. We see that they've increased their basing throughout the high North and the Arctic. They've now reopened a number of their bases. I think it's 10 the last time I counted. And those have been set up with military hardware as well, to include radars, et cetera. And they occasionally move forces there in military exercises. And then finally, they've hinted politically about a year ago a policy that they may, for safety reasons, may have to begin to control any passage in the high North, particularly with the opening sea route potential. I think that's another indication that their intent is to have greater control, and they're putting the forces in place to do that if they have the opportunity. The last point I'll make is that from the high North, we've seen more activity in the last 3 years, I would say, than all the way back to the time period of the Cold War. And they have a modernization of their naval fleet that's worrisome and is actually being done quite well. So those are the things that I look at, and I'm very concerned about the Arctic, as are many others I know in the alliance.
Excellent. General Cavoli, anything you would add to that, or can I move on to this very long list?
Just that in the land domain, General Clark, we certainly see the same thing. That is modernization of the tank fleet in the north, as well as exercises that focus, ironically, given the topic of the seminar, on mobility. And it's of significant enough concern that the Norwegian Army has reestablished their High North Command as a territorial defense command in the northeastern part of the country, up on the border with Russia.
I'm going to give the next question to you, General Scaparrotti. It's from Lauren, and she asks, how are we progressing on integrating cyber resilience and infrastructure survivability requirements into NATO planning? How are you thinking about engagement with the private sector in this space?
Well, first of all, it's a part of the report, and I think an important one that I would point out is the emphasis on the need for cyber and countermeasures to be engineered actually into our infrastructure development. How are we doing? Well, NATO, a couple of years ago decided that cyber was a domain. This is a huge step to accept it as a domain. They also then began to build the force structure that was required within NATO to operate in the cyber domain. That occurred about 2 years ago, and it's moving, I think, quite well. But the report points out there is a lot to be done in terms of incorporating cyber into military mobility, the different infrastructure apparatus, the communications that's required. And there we've got a lot of work to do. And that's why it was one of the more important recommendations in the report.
Next one for you, General Cavoli, from Mark Wiener, which is, what is your perspective on the role of NATO partners, particularly Sweden and Finland, in military mobility?
Very interesting question because of the evolution in the positions of both Sweden and Finland over the last few years. They work on military mobility, obviously, within their own countries. They're focused on territorial defense of their countries. But they participate with us in exercises also that help us to exercise especially the northern parts of our mobility network on the continent itself. So they're partners in this, and we need to be able to move their heavy equipment the same as ours, and they have big modernized fleets that require significant amount of infrastructure improvement in some parts of Eastern Europe, especially.
The next question could go to either of you. It's from Inga, and I want to apologize, Inga, that I am deeply skeptical of my ability to pronounce your last name. I do not mean to diminutize you by only using your first name. Here's her terrific question. How would you assess the current progress and cooperation between EU and NATO on military mobility? As you know, there are certain defense projects, PESCO initiatives, under the new EU defense package, which aim to improve military mobility among EU countries. Could you give your comment on this in terms of duplication or compatibility? I feel like both of you ought to have to fire on that one. General Scaparrotti.
I'll go, Corey. A great question. I appreciate it. If you look to the report, we spend a good deal of time on NATO-EU collaboration with respect to military mobility. And up front, I'll tell you, having been there just a year ago, SAC-Euro, there is a genuine effort between the two institutions to work closer, and there's good collaboration going on. But as the report points out, we look at military mobility in different ways. The EU is more restrictive, and it's more focused on the civilian aspects of that as well, and purely military. Whereas NATO looks at it from a force enablement perspective. That includes the mobility of forces, but also the reinforcement, the sustainment, et cetera, that's got to take place. As the SAC-Euro, frankly, I didn't fully realize the difference in our definitions and the difference in our perspectives, as well as I do now that we've been through the study group. And I think there's a real value in this report for those in both institutions to sit back, evaluate what's being said here, and then try to make the changes and the recommendations that we put forward. Because it's not a lack of effort or desire, but it's just a difference in the institutions that can improve the collaboration that they're doing today. And I'll turn it over to Chris.
Sir, I would just say that during the Defender exercise preparation and execution to the point we got, we had very tight collaboration with the EU during that. And in fact, so I briefed the military committee and had my staff brief some of their subcommittees on a number of occasions. We had observers from the EU's mobility organizations and committees to come observe at our movement control centers how we were doing things and what we saw as the requirements. So I think that it is certainly in a much better place. This cooperation is in a much, much different place than it was, say, in 2015. And this is a very positive thing. I frankly thought that the discussion about the EU and NATO cooperation on this topic was one of the highlights of the report.
Congratulations, gentlemen, for conservation of ordnance, because in your answer to that, you also cleared out retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges' question about the role of the EU in addressing these challenges.
We need to give Ben another.
Ben hasn't looked at mobility at all, has he?
Yeah.
Yeah, this guy has no standing.
Yeah.
General Cavoli, there's a question from Chris that seems up your alley as intensely operational. How is the role of the JSEC developing when it comes to command and control, the delineation of tasks, and its relation to other joint force commands?
Yeah, so it's evolving, and there are, like any institution's evolution, several different stakeholders who have sort of different areas of emphasis on what they hope the JSEC ends up being like. My goal, and I speak to Jürgen Knappe, the commander, quite frequently, my goal is to get to a place where the JSEC is focused on the staging and onward movement of large, heavy forces from west to east across Europe. I think that's where they're going. They were going to use Defender 20 as a primary driver of their establishment of operational capability. And it's a shame we didn't get a little farther into the onward movement piece because they would have had a great opportunity with us. They have a very tight relationship with the 21st Theater Sustainment Command, which is the U.S. Army's principal logistics command in Europe. And that helps us a great deal. We had observers, again, embedded in my headquarters and embedded in the 21st TSC's headquarters during that. So they're moving in the right direction. I'm also very gratified about some personnel decisions made by the German Army with regard to the JSEC. The deputy commander of the JSEC right now is Major General Kai Rohrschneider, and his previous job was to be the chief of staff on loan from Germany of U.S. Army Europe. And the next deputy commander of the JSEC is going to be soon to be Major General Hartmut Renk, who is currently my chief of staff here. So Germany is trying very hard to make sure that experts in the U.S.'s military requirements for mobility to execute large-scale operations here become leaders in the JSEC. So that will help us with the evolution of that command a great deal as well.
So, gentlemen, I think it is a tribute to what an engaging conversation and how much important information you have provided that there's an avalanche of questions we are not able to get to on things like implications of increased Chinese investments in European infrastructure, how to sell the necessary investments to European publics, the role of a reestablished second fleet, and many other good ones. But I am not going to give you the chance to answer any of those because we are the start of a bigger program. So I would just ask you to close out by saying one thing you would like everybody to take away from this rich conversation. And let's start with you, General Cavoli.
Yeah, just the importance of the issue of military mobility in Europe. It is not a topic for us to take lightly or to let our progress regress in any way. In order to be able to perform the collective defense of this alliance, we absolutely have to get faster. I gave a lot of nice examples about how we've gotten better, but it's still not at the place it needs to be if we go into a crisis movement of a large reinforcement across the continent. So I would encourage all of our listeners and all the participants to study the issue and to follow the issue, because I think the chief obstacle to making more progress is going to be losing momentum or losing the will to continue. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Corey.
And General Scaparrotti, close us out, my friend.
Thank you, Corey. I would just say, if you go back to the NATO's improvements and advances since the Wales summit, establishment of the NATO response force, the VJTF, then we put forward forces in the enhanced forward presence. Then we came a year or so ago with NATO Readiness Initiative to get forces in a better readiness posture. Mobility, this improvement in mobility, is the next natural step to ensure that all of those things can move at speed, as General Cavoli was just talking about. That's the importance of this. We need this kind of perspective, and I encourage both NATO, EU, and the nations to invest in this, as we've made recommendations in the report. Again, thanks to Ambassador Bell and to the members of the task force for this important report, and thank you, Corey, for moderating today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for this education, gentlemen. I'm passing the baton back to the Atlantic Council for the next part of our program.
Thank you very much, Corey, and good morning, everyone. I'm Barry Pavel, the director of the Council's Scowcroft Center. That was a really great conversation. Thanks in particular to our co-chairs, General Scaparrotti and Ambassador Bell, for joining us and for their leadership. Thanks to Lieutenant General Cavoli, and also to you, Corey. Thank you. Don't tune out. We have a really excellent panel discussion starting shortly. Before we do so, just a brief recap. It's really been an honor to hear from Lieutenant General Cavoli about some of the operational aspects of military mobility. I thought he left us with some very important insights, in particular about the lessons learned for mobility from the Defender 20 exercise, including how clearance times have been reduced and other improvements, in the real world operational questions that ultimately redound to the alliance's deterrent and military readiness. Also, some thoughts about how the unfolding coronavirus may challenge momentum moving forward. And I think obviously there's high uncertainty there. And so we should all watch that very closely. Here at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center, we've been doing a lot of work on the geostrategic implications of the coronavirus. And in fact, just today, just within the hour, we released a major new Atlantic Council strategy paper called What World Post-COVID-19 by our own Matt Burrows, who with some prescience saw this coming and some of the work he did in the intelligence community in 2008 and in other timeframes. In this paper, Matt, with his co-author Peter Engelke, outlines 3 scenarios for the global system coming out of the pandemic, and obviously where those scenarios go will affect this important question of military mobility and the alliance. The Council sees its role as trying to help shape the world toward the positive scenario, but please take a look on our website. I thought our project co-chairs, General Scaparrotti and Ambassador Bell, did a tremendous job leading this effort. It was really useful to hear also from General Scaparrotti during the discussion about the big strategic issues at play here, how this fits in this critical area for transatlantic defense and security. And also, I thought his insight that a large forward U.S. presence may not be the most effective approach, that it's really about rapid reinforcement which really puts obviously a huge premium on the set of questions we're addressing today. They're not just logistical questions, they're critical logistical questions. They're operational, but they're also really strategic. I'm certainly looking forward to building upon these types of insights from our last discussion as we take a deeper dive with our next panel. And we have a truly star-studded transatlantic panel joining us from both sides of the Atlantic. They will come at this issue from several perspectives that will help us all get a better understanding of military mobility, how it's working now, but also what's in store for the near and medium-term future. So joining us for this discussion are first, Maja Cochrane-Marsoc. She is Deputy Director General for Mobility and Transport at the European Commission. Second, my longtime friend and colleague, NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning, Patrick Turner. Great to see you, Patrick. Third, Lars Walria. He is Director for International Affairs and Operations at the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And representing our task force, we have the former NATO Deputy Secretary General, the Atlantic Council's own Ambassador Sandy Vershbow. To moderate this formidable panel, we're privileged to have Katie Bo Williams. You may know her as the Senior National Security Correspondent from Defense One. Thank you very much, Ms. Williams, for leading this discussion. Before I turn it over to Katie Bo, I've certainly been following on Twitter and retweeting myself. I'd like to remind everyone to join that conversation online by following @Atlantic Council and @AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag #ACDefense. And of course, throughout this discussion, I see this is not a shy group. Please continue to engage and submit your questions via the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom screens. As with the first discussion, we really want to hear from you in this one as well. And so with that, Katie Bo, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you guys to everybody who's joining us from your couches or your living room or your basement or wherever you are right now. This was a discussion that I was excited to be involved in because military mobility in Europe is one of those security concepts that seems really simple. Of course, you have to be able to move militaries around in the event of a potential conflict, but because it lives at this juncture of civil and military governance, turns out it's an incredibly complex space with a lot of stakeholders, many of whom I have on the virtual stage with me right now. So I want to open this discussion by giving each of the panelists an opportunity to kind of give us a little bit of an opening statement to help us frame the discussion, and then we'll dig into some of the policy detail from there. So I'm gonna come to each of y'all in turn. Ambassador Vershbow, if you want to start us off. As a member of the task force behind the report, I'm hoping you can give us kind of a broad assessment of military mobility efforts today, February 23rd, and perhaps a quick sense of what you see as the most important issues to be addressed from the report.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much, Katie Bo. It's a great honor to have been part of this task force because I think they've been very successful in producing a very important, very timely set of recommendations. It was also great to work with General Scaparrotti, who started his term as SAC here when I was still Deputy Secretary General. And I should also congratulate the people who did the real work on this report. I don't pretend to have been a drafter, especially Wayne Schroeder, Clementine, Starling, and Connor Radahan. It was quite a feat to disaggregate the many dimensions of the military mobility challenge and to explain how both individual member nations and two very different institutions can better work together to untangle the many issues. And I'm quite hopeful that the report's recommendations will have a real impact on the work that's underway inside NATO and the EU and in European capitals. We've already heard from our other speakers today that military mobility is a final piece in the puzzle in terms of rebuilding and in some ways relearning defense and deterrence in Europe in an era of renewed great power competition. Improving mobility is the capstone to the measures NATO has adopted since 2014, and it's crucial to the credibility of NATO's strategy of deterrence, which is based on rapid reinforcement. Without a comprehensive strategy for military mobility, those earlier measures, including the NATO Readiness Initiative, the so-called 430s, adopted at the last summit in 2018, will be inadequate to the task. In addition, many of the challenges that have to be resolved pertain to transportation infrastructure, ports, railways, airfields, sea lift and airlift, border crossings that are inherently dual use. And that's why military mobility is a natural area for a whole of government approach by individual nations, spanning both the military and the civilian sectors, and for close collaboration between NATO and the EU. Neither organization can address all the challenges together. And I think that's sort of the overarching message of the report. Now, we've heard from other speakers that the task is an urgent one. Basically, NATO ignored the question of military mobility and reinforcement when it admitted new members from Central and Eastern Europe beginning in 1999. With the disappearance of the Russian threat, it didn't matter that NATO infrastructure didn't extend beyond the old front line in Germany, and that much of that infrastructure, if it still existed at all, was obsolete in the face of changing technology. So the agreement reached in the 2018 NATO-EU joint declaration to collaborate on military mobility was a real breakthrough. And a lot of work was initiated in 2018 and 2019, but it does risk losing momentum as nations struggle with the COVID-19 crisis and the political economic challenges that have accompanied that crisis. So the task force offers a rich menu of ideas for ways that NATO and EU, both at the national level and at the collective level, can begin to fully deliver on the 2018 commitment and set the right priorities, recognizing that this is going to be a multi-year effort. Not everything has to happen at once, but I think there's also little room for delay, and we've heard that from other speakers as well. So I would highlight, first of all, the first recommendation in the report, which is for a sustained multi-year commitment to funding for military mobility by both the EU and by the alliance. Without the resources, all the specific ideas in the report will be very difficult to implement. And it was indeed quite alarming as the report was going through its final drafts that we heard, and this was even before the coronavirus crisis, we heard that the EU Commission had cut the funding for military mobility in the multi-year financial framework by more than half and was considering zeroing it out entirely. And this would literally stop the mobility effort at the starting gate and call into question the EU's reliability as a partner for NATO, with grave implications for the burden sharing debate. In fact, I think that in the next few years, the European Union and European nations will need to shoulder more responsibility for their own defense, not less, as the United States pays more attention to the competition with China and to reviving its own economy after the COVID-19 crisis. At the same time, I would say military mobility is an opportunity for European allies and the EU to refocus the burden sharing debate on an area where they have real resources and capabilities to put on the table if they have the political will to do so. So it's absolutely critical that these planned cuts be reversed. Now, beyond multi-year funding, I can't kind of go through all the recommendations of the report. It is quite voluminous, but worth reading from cover to cover. But I would like to highlight a few other specific recommendations that I think are important, and I'd be interested in the European panelists' reaction to them. First of all is the importance of developing mobility goals tied to the NATO Readiness Initiative, the 430s initiative, and to seek to leverage their implementation through the NATO defense planning process. Also critical with the Defender 20 exercise having been curtailed, to ensure that starting next year we have a very robust program of exercises to show that the progress that's being made in addressing the mobility issue is actually implementable in crisis conditions. I think it's also worth active consideration of making more military mobility infrastructure projects eligible for NATO common funding, which is one of the recommendations in the report. Some of these infrastructure projects, which might be considered national responsibilities, are certainly beyond the capabilities of some of the smaller member nations. The same applies to measures to enhance the network and cyber resilience of our infrastructure, which General Scaparrotti emphasized a few minutes ago. So I think there's a good case for using common funding to finance projects which will ultimately benefit all allies and shouldn't be allowed to get cut because of traditionally doctrinaire views about common funding. Another one I would highlight in the same vein is this idea of a European multinational deterrence initiative, an MDI, which would be a European analog for the US European Deterrence Initiative. And this would be a voluntary fund financed by European allies to promote investment in infrastructure projects where EU funding or national funding is not readily available. It could be used to incentivize public-private partnerships. I think there should be ways for allies to get credit for these kinds of voluntarily funded infrastructure projects against the 2% goal. Again, it would be, I think it's an innovative way to get more resources in addition to what the two institutions are able to provide themselves. Finally, the report places a lot of emphasis on the need to strengthen the ability of NATO and the EU to consult and coordinate and to plan together, which should be a simple task, but because of the asymmetry in memberships, it's been a difficult issue for many decades for these two institutions in the same city to actually sit down at the same table. But I'd be interested in our European colleagues' reaction to some of these proposals, or whether they think we should continue to rely on the ad hoc, informal staff-to-staff contacts rather than trying to formalize some of the consultation. One last idea, I'll stop right after this one, is this idea of a joint military mobility competence center, which would be similar to the Joint Air Power Competence Center that NATO has had for several years. This could serve kind of the function of centers of excellence in terms of promoting new ideas, outside of the box approaches to mobility and logistics challenges, while keeping it inside the command structure and subject to tasking by the NATO commanders. But I think we're going to need a lot of innovation if we're going to solve some of the difficult problems relating to military mobility, particularly in an era of funding restrictions. So I would encourage people to take a look at this idea of a JMMCC in the report. Anyway, there's dozens of other ideas. Again, congratulations to the task force for coming up with quite a formidable menu. But if we don't get the funding on a sustained multi-year basis, a lot of this will be for naught.
Yes, I think the Ambassador, thank you for that. I think the funding is going to be one of the issues that we're going to want to dig into here during this discussion. I want to turn to Mr. Turner next, and I'm hoping that you can, obviously mobility is really your shop at NATO, and so I'm hoping you can kind of, to sort of help us frame here, give us just very briefly a sense of what NATO's been doing on the issue of mobility, and do you think the alliance is adequately prioritizing it right now?
Thank you very much, Katie Bow. Thanks for the chance to participate, and thanks for a great report studied with lots of ideas and which throws down a fairly large gauntlet for NATO, but also reflects some of the things that we are prioritizing. One or two quick thoughts. As others have said, our strategy deliberately depends on rapid reinforcement, so that matters greatly to us. And a reminder, that's rapid reinforcement with what we call a 360-degree perspective. So it's not just in one direction, it could be in more than one direction. We at the London NATO leaders meeting last December, allies completed offering what's been referred to already, the 430s, so 30 kinetic air squadrons, 30 combat ships, 30 medium or heavy battalions, and those are meant to be employable in 30 days. So obviously mobility matters greatly in that context. And we, I think the report reflects the wider view of this that we take here at NATO. So we talk about enablement of SACEUR's area of responsibility. So and that's both in Europe and across the Atlantic. And that's all of the things that you need to do to enable forces to move, operate, be sustained, and be effective if they had to be employed. So we have a wide focus. There is no lessening of focus here on building the deterrence and defense posture, which we have been actively building since especially the actions that Russia took in Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014. I've seen no sign whatsoever of a lessened appetite for doing the work necessary to build that posture. I agree absolutely that we need to maintain focus and momentum in this area. We fully intend to do that, and you heard the energy being put into that by military colleagues within NATO. Now, I just say, in terms of investment, this does not stand or fall on whether or not there is significant EU funding in dual-use infrastructure, roads, and so on. We very much welcome that investment, but a lot of investment in enablement, expenditure, airfields, mobility requirements, logistic requirements, supply requirements goes in through the NATO defense planning process and through NATO common budgets. There are some great ideas in the report about how we connect our 430s, the so-called Readiness initiative, increasing and improving the readiness of our forces, how we connect our defense planning process, which provides the disciplined way that we set targets for nations and mobility. So thank you for good and interesting ideas. But be in no doubt, allies are investing heavily in enablement. We heard earlier there are two new headquarters, one in Norfolk, Virginia, one in Ulm, Germany, which are all about reinforcement, enablement, mobility, and so on. Two last points in this first round. One, this is an area of good and close cooperation with EU colleagues. We have a structured dialogue covering lots of issues where we can work together to make mobility work in terms of regulations, border crossings, national points of contact to ensure and improve rapid mobility. And then last point, this is clearly an area where whole of government is required. It's a complex area. And then very last, a large thank you to US colleagues for many things as ever. The European Deterrence Initiative, the sort of investments that's gone into infrastructure, pre-positioning, forward presence, that is part of this, I hope and expect that it will remain. Thanks also, as we heard earlier from General Cavoli, for all the work which went into and the lessons we have been learning and will be learning from Defender 2020. And we're looking forward to those exercises continuing in future years. It's not a one shot. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Ms. Bachran-Marsic, I'm gonna go to you next. Tell us a little bit about the Commission's role in pushing this issue forward, and then since this has already obviously come up a couple of times, what the 2021-27 budget negotiations might mean for mobility efforts going forward.
Yes, hi, good afternoon from Brussels, and thank you for inviting me to join you. And first of all, really thanks for the great report. Now, as to what is going on our side, let's look back. It's taken only 2 years, which is quite light speed when you look at the EU institutions' pace in how we deal with events. So in March 2018, we have launched the action plan of military mobility. The needs were obvious. We saw physical, legal, and regulatory barriers to move military forces, their assets and equipment swiftly within and beyond EU borders. On one hand, and this has been talked a lot so far as well, we have barriers that include infrastructure, but at the same time, we also have cumbersome customs procedures, and not to even speak of permissions for the military movements. So what we tried to do is to base ourselves on 2 pillars. First of all, to look at the transport infrastructure, and then secondly, to really look at these regulatory and procedural issues what EU is so good at. So when it comes to infrastructure pillar, our starting point, and we worked really together with the EU member states and of course with our colleagues and partners in NATO to define a common set of military requirements for infrastructure. So really to see what are the gaps, what do we require when we invest in civilian infrastructure, and what would be the additional military requirements. We also included in this work a look into what is the military geographic network and how does it correspond with the so-called Trans-European transport network. What we needed to know, and we know now, is which exact roads, railway lines, airports, seaports, and inland waterways in the EU should conform to specific standards so that, as stressed before, equipment, personnel, and military material can move freely. We then followed with the gap analysis between military requirements and the civilian trans-European transport network. And we actually saw that the overlap is a very high 93% in between these 2 maps. So I repeat, 93% overlap. And then in addition, after looking into all the requirements, we realized that they are in fact quite similar, that the gap between military and civilian standards is smaller than we had expected. There's still significant gaps, but much smaller than expected. So what we concluded in this work is that actually it is possible to say that the EU transport infrastructure does allow for military mobility. However, of course, further investments are certainly necessary. If I may just stop for a moment here, because investment was already highlighted. Indeed, especially also when you look at the Eastern Europe, but also all around Europe, it's not that we have 21st century standards in transport infrastructure. Of course, there's a lot of investment in our civilian transport network, and this will be done. And then in addition to also satisfy the military standards. What is currently taking place, and actually this afternoon as we speak, the European leaders are also holding a video conference, and they're discussing the next 7-year EU budget. In normal circumstances, there's always very difficult debate. Of course, this time around with the Corona crisis, this will be additionally difficult. But again, the negotiations on the next 7 years budget to kick in from 21 until 27 are underway. And from our side, of course, the Commission has made several proposals. We will Also, following this important meeting today, the Commission, due to the current crisis, will come with the revised proposal, and then we hope and invite the Member States and, of course, the European Parliament to adopt the budget. But there will still be some difficult discussions ahead. But again, what I would like to stress, the instrument that we use is the Connecting Europe facility to invest into civilian infrastructure. And this is where we also propose to give additional envelope that we could then use to top up and to also invest in this, as we call it, dual-use military, to satisfy military requirements. In the past period, we had 24 billion euros in our Connecting Europe facility, and we, in our proposal, have proposed around 30 for the next 7-year budget. Again, we are in the hands of our political masters to decide on the final budget that we will have at our disposal. However, what has to be said, we will have a significant instrument, and based on the work so far, we are looking into how to include some of the detected military dual-use infrastructure requirements as binding for our overall investment in these European networks. I'd also like to dedicate just a few sentences to the second pillar that is also very important and that is unfolding and far less budgetary demanding, if at all, and that is really to tackle procedural and regulatory barriers. So we have some good examples. We have been able to get all of our member states to commit to grant cross-border movement permissions within 5 working days. And I think it was already mentioned as a positive example earlier in the discussions today. We have also been able to establish simplified and streamlined customs procedures, as well as some harmonized rules on transport of dangerous military goods. So all of this, and of course there's still some way to go, will reduce administrative burden and allow for swift cross-border military mobility. So to conclude, we really are aware of the importance of military mobility, of the changing world around us, and improving the mobility of military forces will, of course, goes without saying, enhance our EU's deterrence against outside threats and enable us as the EU institutions and our member states to act faster in line with defense needs and responsibilities, including in NATO framework. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this work in coordination with NATO. We are really working in order to complement each other. And I think I can safely say, I believe everybody will agree with me, that military mobility can be seen as a flagship project of EU-NATO cooperation, and as we are really reinforcing each other. So again, a lot of work ahead, but we have altogether already made quite some progress that probably a few years back, people just didn't see it coming, but it is happening, and it's happening very fast.
Great. Well, thank you so much, ma'am. I think we'll turn last but not least to Mr. Malreve. The Netherlands has been really forward-leaning on the issue of mobility, and so I'm hoping you can talk to us about the experience of coordinating this effort within your own government, and then perhaps give us just a quick assessment of sort of where you think the allies are in making progress on this issue.
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for their excellent reports. I think it's clear that a lot of effort has been put into this report, and the conclusions from the report deserve close attention in our capitals and in Brussels. It also, and it's been mentioned before, it comes at a critical time. Military mobility is featured high on the political agenda since the summer of 2018. Much work has been initiated, and I think in 2020 it is up to us to actively continue this and make sure the work doesn't go to waste. I'll briefly mention 3 highlights to illustrate this. I think that the different fora dealing with military mobility can seem confusing at first, but it seems to come down to one crucial element: national implementation. EU member states, as well as NATO allies, have committed themselves to a couple of commitments, deliverables, one of which, for example, is to ensure border crossing within a certain amount of days. And I think if we really can achieve this in Europe, implement this would mean a considerable acceleration of military mobility. Second thing we're looking at is the EU-NATO cooperation. I think there's a lot of attention at the political level. They're clear on the importance of the cooperation between both the EU and NATO. But in practice, we still see a couple of hurdles. The challenge we face is to bring the institutions even more together and foster real cooperation. Thirdly, implementation in the Netherlands. From the beginning onwards, we've been working very closely together with all the other departments involved in military cooperation. For now, we're working on our national plan. We're finalizing these months. Both NATO and the EU have called upon the nations to develop these national plans and give their implementations high priority. We believe this is the cornerstone of concrete improvements for the coming years. A national plan accelerating military mobility along the internationally agreed commitments provide a solid basis for the coming years. As for the Netherlands, will not be surprising, our concept national plan centers around one theme, the Netherlands as a transit nation. As we recognize that we have a strategically important role for our allies, with increasing numbers of troops passing through, we want to formalize this role in a long-term way. Well, in economic sense, we're a gateway to Europe. We also want to be the gateway to Europe in a military sense.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for helping us sort of frame this conversation. I just want to put out a reminder to the audience. If you have questions that you would like posed to the panelists, you can submit them in the Q&A feature in the Zoom taskbar at the bottom of your screens. We've already got a bunch of great questions coming in. So I'm going to kind of kick off the conversation with, I think, a question about sort of what the elephant in the room right now is, which is obviously the impact of coronavirus. And then I'm going to start turning to some audience questions. So Mr. Turner, I think I'd like to start with you for this one, but I'd look forward to hearing what everybody on the panel has to say. What long-term impacts on mobility efforts do you foresee in sort of the fallout from this pandemic? Is this just a short-term disruption to planning efforts, or does it have broader strategic implications?
So thank you very much. Great question indeed. Generically, the question that's on everybody's minds at the moment. I would say, based on experience of earlier, major shocks, inflection points, whatever you call it, personally, at least, I would be hesitant to start making big forecasts, drawing big conclusions from what is happening now. What we certainly know here at NATO is that the threats and challenges we face have not suddenly gone away. They may change and morph. They may challenge us in new ways. It's certainly the case that potential adversaries, challengers, would like to be able, amongst other things, to interfere with our ability to reinforce, to move, to use infrastructure, and so on. So the strategic picture, defense and security picture, has not suddenly changed out of all recognition. So that's the first part of the answer. I know that there has been lots of conversation about the potential impact that COVID, as we go forward, will have on national budgets, national priorities. Will that put at risk some of the gains that we've been making across the alliance in defence spending? We just said in London in December that so far we had commitments to increase defence expenditure, and quite a lot of those commitments are delivered by a total of $400 billion in non-US defence spending, extra money in the 4 years to this year, and then in the next 4 years we'll see what the impact is. But one happy fact is that the targets we have set to allies on defence spending are in relation to GDP. So if GDP alters, then the amount of money that people have to spend on defence also alters, where we certainly don't want GDP in any ally to be going down. Last point I'd make, I think COVID tells us very strongly that investment in advance, in preparedness, in resilience is good investment. So I imagine that is certainly in the Alliance, we're going to be putting more focus on resilience. We're reviewing what we call our baseline requirements for resilience urgently now, also in the light of COVID. So resilience and preparedness are one form of insurance policy, if you like. I think there's nothing in the environment that we face which says that we should suddenly start diminishing the insurance policy that is our defense capability and our defense spending. And by the way, COVID illustrates powerfully all over the Alliance that armed forces are exceptionally useful things to have in a whole variety of circumstances. So not just in overseas operations or collective defense, but right now, tens and hundreds of thousands of people participating in helping the COVID response.
I'm gonna piggyback off of that a little bit with our first audience question, and I think I'm gonna send this to Ms. Bakran-Marsic, if I think you might be the right person to address this. So this is from Hans in Benedict. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not 100% sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Selling the mobility initiative and the related readiness initiative to European publics will obviously be more difficult in the post-coronavirus budget environment. What else can be done to sell this to the European public? And I think I would sort of extend that from there and say, have EU politicians been doing a good enough job of essentially getting the necessary public buy-in to push some of these initiatives forward? And is that harder in a world where we are sort of in a either COVID recovery period or a belt-tightening period?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. Well, unfortunately, even if we look at the period before the crisis, and the things happening in the world, it became increasingly obvious that we just cannot take for granted the period that we lived in before, and that various challenges and dangers were emerging. So again, it will, of course, be important to continue talking to the public, but I think people increasingly realize the need to also invest in this area. As I said, what is crucial to emphasize is that it is not two types of investment. It is an investment in infrastructure. And maybe I could draw a link here into what has been happening in Europe in the last month and a half or so since we've been exposed to the crisis. Goods are flowing. Our infrastructure has proven resilient. The border controls went up, but we have been able, together with the member states, to implement an initiative called the Green Lane. So everywhere in Europe, you have Italian goods moving on trucks or trains to Germany, or from Portugal to the Baltics. And this has actually, in my mind, once we get out of or start getting out of the crisis and start analyzing what has happened, this, if anything else, should reinforce the importance of functioning European transport networks, and of course the need to invest in it further, and also to ensure that it is resilient. So again, I think that there is lessons to be learned here that should help us to ensure this functioning network for all kinds of purposes, including military purpose in the future.
Before I hop on to the next audience question here, is there anything else that anyone wants to add sort of specifically on the COVID-19 angle?
Yes, if I may?
Yes, please. Mr.
Well, now we're talking budget, and of course, budget plays an important role, I think, in implementing a lot of the measures. But on the other hand, there are still quite some other things to be done in regulations, in rules, in procedures. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. For example, in the Netherlands, we're quite unhappy with the faxes and emails we still use for providing host nation support. We developed a tool for that, internet tool for that. We're gonna make it available for other nations as well. These are the things we can do even, without budget or less budget. One of the other examples is the cooperations we have with the Department of Infrastructure in the Netherlands. We've made a gap analysis as well with them. there are certain things on the list for renovation or building new bridges or whatever, where we can take into account, apart from the civilian requirements, also the military requirements, just without adding any budget or doing things different. So it's being a bit creative as well, I think.
That's great. Our next, I'm going to pull in another audience question here from Laredo. The conversation so far has focused on military mobility, but sustainment is also a crucial part of deterrence. For example, availability of fuel is crucial to supporting operations. How much work has been done on assuring that the theater itself is set? I think I might send this one back to Mr. Turner.
So thank you very much. Great question indeed. As I was saying earlier, we think about enablement and mobility as part of enablement. So indeed, setting the theatre, that's slightly jargon language, but is part of this. So the ability not only to move, but to supply the forces that you are moving to ensure they have the stockpiles, the ability to operate for the length of time that you want them to operate once they've moved from A to B. So a lot of work has also been done on that. That is part of the enablement and mobility work that we're doing here. Within NATO, within the alliance, there is a Cold War system called the Central European Pipeline System, which is one specific fuel supply system that we use that also supports a number of civilian airports. But we're going to, and I referred earlier, we are investing a lot of money, billions, both through NATO common budgets, but also through national budgets, through the NATO defense planning process, targets set on nations within that process for exactly these purposes. I think there is the focus at very high level on these issues. Enablement and mobility has put a spotlight on that. I don't think the spotlight is going to go away. So some of that money which European allies have promised to spend in addition to their previous plans will be going on logistics, sustainment, if you like, the basics of supporting military operations. And I will throw in the thought, which I heard on a large NATO exercise from one of our commanders, that logistics is the sixth domain beyond the obvious three, and cyber and space. I think that's absolutely true.
We've talked, or we've heard a lot today, I think, about the importance of EU and NATO coordination to pushing all of the different sort of concepts associated with improvement to mobility through. And I'd like to go back to Mr. Walravy for a minute, and at the expense of putting you on the spot here, sir, I'd like to offer you the question of from your position as part of a nation that is involved in both of these. In both of these organizations, what is, or both these institutions, what is your assessment of EU-NATO cross cooperation on mobility efforts right now, and what are the sort of biggest cross-institutional obstacles that you've found?
Well, I briefly mentioned that in my introduction already. We think there's, at the political level, there's a lot of commitment to have the EU and NATO cooperate. What we see in practice is that working on some issues. On the others, we think there's still more possible. But in the end, it really doesn't matter whether it's NATO or it's EU. It's all about the nations being responsible for implementation for the measures to make military mobility possible. So they're more like, well, platforms that have to talk to each other and agree on standards. But in the end, it's up to the nations. And as the Netherlands, we're leading the EU PESCO project on military mobility. And well, we're trying to connecting all the dots, not only within EU and the PESCO project, but also with what's going on in NATO, of course, to have everyone aligned and well, move in the same direction on these issues.
Well, there are there's obviously individual nationally driven efforts like the Netherlands-driven PESCO mobility project, JSEC in Germany, and so I think one of the questions that I'd ask is, what sort of potential opportunities do you see, and I would open this up to the panel as well, for related initiatives in other countries? Like, what are the holes that need to be filled?
What you see is that by leading the PESCO projects and being in NATO as well, you see networks that evolve and that come around. People see each other, speak to each other. So I think we're all learning from each other by trying and doing. I mentioned the facilities for host nation support, of course. This is something that other nations can learn of. So I think it's important to have the network, to understand where we're heading, and helping each other. Best lessons learned, sharing them within the community that needs it.
I'm going to open this one up to the panel and see who wants to take this. This is another audience question from Rafael Demisowicz. What are the implications, if any, of increased Chinese investment in European infrastructure, ports, etc., on military mobility needs related to the large-scale deployment of U.S. troops on Europe's soil? Who wants to? I was going to say, Mr. Turner.
So just a quick add-on to the last discussion, just to say really clearly from our side, we regard both what the EU is doing, the work with the EU on this, as a core bit of our cooperation, a piece of the cooperation which works really well. I'm sure it is always possible to get better, but we have a very strong and, as I say, a structured dialogue, and that that has been working on the list of things that you've been hearing about. Ditto, a big thank you to the Netherlands for their lead on this issue, both the PESCO project, but also sort of, if you like, intellectual lead as both an EU member state and an ally. So thank you very much. On Chinese investment in critical infrastructure, and in this case, things like ports. This matters greatly. The statistics on the number of, for example, major container ports around the world in which there is at the least a significant Chinese stake are significant. More than half of the 50 main container ports around the world, there is a significant Chinese stake. So that has implications for all of us, if you like. It's not just in the defense and security field. It's worth thinking about for all of us. But I think we are going, Europe is, other countries are and should be thinking quite hard about what the implications of that are, and we're certainly thinking about what the implications of that are in terms of the ability to support movement, reinforcement, and military operations. We need to make very sure that critical infrastructure, ports, airports, whatever it is, are usable in a crisis, and there is no ability by state actors to prevent their use.
Are there any? Yes, please.
Yes, if I may just add on the issue of Chinese investment, we already have developed, again, also in the last, less than 2 years, some tools for indirect investment in critical infrastructure screening. So these investments are to be screened. We are working with the member states. There is, from quite some sides, also requests to develop these tools further. So we're also looking into how to incorporate these requirements into our revision of the future TEN-T regulations. So under which conditions would somebody be able to profit from EU funding? So what would be the requirements for the core network, for the strategic infrastructure, and those things? So I'm pretty sure that this debate will move forward, and that we'll see more and more tools emerging. But of course, at the end of the day, in a number of situations, it is the member states themselves making decisions on investment. So we also need to work together.
Are there particular concerns associated with Chinese investment in telecommunications infrastructure? I mean, that's obviously something that's been a major sort of irritant and concern, I would say, on the U.S. side. Does that raise different implications than, for example, the concerns over port access?
Well, I can address it to an extent. Of course, it's related, but also relatively a different debate. And we've all we're actually just starting this debate, and then member states again were making their own decisions. There was a couple of months ago, since like ages ago, before Corona thing started, there was a clear communication from the Commission giving guidance to the member states to really look carefully into this type of strategic infrastructure. And at the end of the day, this is the same also with the transport and energy as well. And actually, all three sectors also function on the basis of networks. We have trans-European networks in transport, energy, and digital. And it's really, again, in the hands of our political leaders. Europe should find the money to finance these networks itself.
I'm going to go back to another audience question. I'm going to send this one to Ambassador Vershbow. This is from Meiji Benia. We talk a lot about military mobility toward the Baltic Sea region, but how can we strengthen security and ensure mobility within the Baltic Sea region? Ambassador, if you want to unmute your...
Yeah, sorry. There we go. That's a very good question. I think that each nation, first of all, has the primary responsibility for continuing to fulfill its own commitments to modernize its forces, including the necessary facilities that will enable other allies to bring the reinforcements in terms of logistics, in terms of pre-positioning sites. I think they can help themselves by coordinating with the U.S. and other reinforcing nations to ensure that they have the facilities that will allow the arriving material to work. And I think it also goes to some of these questions we were just discussing about ensuring the appropriate legislative authorities to regulate Chinese and other state actors who may be investing in their economies, to ensure that they have the necessary safeguards to prevent any interference with military movements during a crisis. So these may be issues that will be easier to address in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. I think the one lesson I think we're learning is the risks of overdependence on China for medical supply chains. That may also perhaps lead to kind of a more enlightened approach to setting limits on Chinese investment in dual-use sectors that could have military implications.
Let me ask you a follow-up here. How do we ensure mobility from north to south and east to west, including to address challenges in the Black Sea region as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the task force report does emphasize that mobility is not only about west to east, although that's the most challenging task that NATO has to worry about, particularly since 2014, but that there are lots of scenarios for crises along the southern flank in the Black Sea, the ability to reinforce Allied forces in southeastern Europe has to be part of this. So it requires more than just the rail infrastructure, which may be the focus of our recommendations on the west-east, but more airlift, more sea lift, ensuring that the ports are upgraded to receive additional material, that we have the cyber defense to prevent the Russian use of hybrid methods to impede the flow through of reinforcements. We need I think as Patrick stressed in his remarks at the beginning, this 360-degree approach, and there'll have to be some differentiation of what we emphasize, depending on the scenario that you're planning against.
We have just about 5 minutes left here. This has obviously been a wide-ranging discussion that has covered a lot of ground. So I want to give everybody an opportunity to just kind of tie together any loose strings that they feel may have been raised here. If you can take just a minute or less, if there's anything you want to sort of close off here, round off any edges, so to speak. Since we've already got you up, Ambassador Vershbow, I'll start with you. Anything that you think we've sort of missed, any ideas that you want to kind of bring home before we close out today?
Yeah. Don't think we've missed anything. But again, I want to highlight that there's a lot of ideas in this report that are worth examining. And I would add that I come away a little bit more encouraged by what I've heard from our European colleagues about the progress that's been achieved, particularly in establishing a kind of a structured process for NATO and the EU to work these issues together. I've been toiling in these fields for decades, and it's been very difficult to get NATO and the EU to work together. I think that it's encouraging that we've been able to do that in the last 2 years. And I do hope that the COVID crisis doesn't divert resources away from this critically important effort. On that score, what Ms. von Marsoc said about the upcoming deliberations on the multi-year financial framework also gives me cause for some hope that some of the draconian cuts discussed a few weeks ago will not come to pass. I think that's critically important because the issues aren't going to go away, the threats aren't going to go away, and we have to maintain the momentum on this effort.
Mr. Turner, we want to go to you.
So firstly, just to say again, thank you for the opportunity, and great to see old friends, old bosses, in some cases one and the same. Thank you for all the slew of really excellent and thought-provoking ideas there. Great ideas, both for NATO. We will go away and take them seriously, and for other colleagues, EU. But as people have said all the way through, lots of the heavy lifting on this is actually down to individual countries, individual allies, individual EU member states. But a strong promise here that we are not going to lose our focus on this. It has been a focus. It needs to be a focus. It will be a focus. This really matters because, as people have said, our strategy depends on it. So we cannot afford to let it go. Thank you anyway.
Ms. Bachmann-Marsoc?
Thank you. Well, from my side, again, to emphasize that we have come a long way, and there's more ground to be covered. We will have investment mechanisms, and the good work we did is really enabling us to use it and to satisfy the standards, and to also, let's see if we are also able to make them obligatory. I would like to once again thank you very much for the report, and in particular thank all the participants, and thank you for your questions. It's really been lively, and thank you for your interest. Take care and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. And Mr. Walrufi, back to you.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, I think we've covered quite some topics. I think military mobility is on the agenda for a couple of years now, and I think it's really worth, and we need to keep it in the agenda, and we keep it high in the agenda. I think your report really helps. It's a timely report. It's got right recommendations, and it gives us, well, at least food for thought. For us on the national level, we keep busy with the implementation of everything that we agreed already, and trying to look for new initiatives, trying to even strengthen EU and NATO cooperation. And, well, I wish you all do the same, so we can have, well, sort of meeting like this in a couple of years, and then see that we made progress in the meantime. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much to everybody on the panel for all of your thoughtful insight today. And thank you so much to all of you who have joined from home. This concludes the event for today. Thanks so much for having us, for your thoughtful questions. Remember to get up and take a few steps around the house. And everybody, thank you, stay healthy, and take care.